Chocolate? Chocolate! Chocolate!
Hello everybody, Chocolate Guy here, and welcome back to another countdown. I'm finally back to talk about The Simpsons, more specifically, the 5th season and the best episodes of it. Now, Season 5 is kind of an odd one, because of just how transitional it is, from the point where the show really hit its groove in Season 4, and when it hit its peak in Season 6. Even after rewatching it, I'm not quite sure how to feel. I mean, obviously this is a classic Simpsons season that is great, but where do I stand on it compared to the others? Well, surprisingly enough, this might just be my favorite so far. Now, to be fair, it is very close in quality with the last two, but I think it's a bit more consistent than they are, and I like the great episodes just a bit more. Now, to be fair, the next two seasons blow this one out of the water, and we'll get there when we get there, but I was pleasantly surprised with how much I enjoyed this season and the direction it took for it being so different, due to this being 5 seasons in, and them changing around writers so much, and just the direction of how this show is gonna go. I really enjoyed it, and I think it is overall an improvement, or at least on the exact same level of quality as the last 2 seasons. But it might be, to my personal preference, just a bit more. And on that note, this might be the strongest top 5 list of The Simpsons so far that I've made, just in terms of sheer episode quality. This season is very interested in looking at character dynamics through interesting, more detailed stories while subverting your expectations every step of the way. And while this isn't exactly the direction I think I would have taken, this is still closer to what I want out of this show. I like that we get to look more into our characters just a bit more here. And yeah, sure, there's no episode in this season which is as interesting of a character deep dive as some of the stuff they did in Season 2, and hint hint, some of the stuff they're going to do in Season 6 and 7, but these plots are still a lot more fleshed out and way more interesting. And we still get to learn a bit more about our characters here and just see interesting aspects about them we haven't gotten to see as much of in the last 2 seasons. And the subversiveness of it all keeps the comedy fresh and takes these stories in interesting directions. Sure, it doesn't always work, and certain episodes can come off as too subversive in a dumb or over-the-top way, and this season is only an amount more character-driven than Season 4. As I said, we haven't quite reached Season 6 yet, but the plots are really what drives it home just because how interesting and different most of them are. But I do think how subversive the season can be does keep some of these interesting stories from playing out in the best way they possibly could. Sometimes it feels like the episode is just being subversive for the sake of being subversive, when going with a much more predictable ending could have benefited the episode and made it a more satisfying and sometimes even a more interesting experience, even if the ending is kind of predictable. But it does take the plots in interesting places most of the time. So overall, this is an interesting new direction for the show to take that I really appreciate and think was the right direction to go in. And well, yeah, a lot of the really interesting stuff here and a lot of these ideas have huge and much better payoffs in the next seasons. And some of the great stuff here can't quite match up to some of the great stuff earlier in the show. This is still a great season for many different reasons, and just because of how very different it is from what came before it. All this makes for an interesting season with some very interesting, not to mention fantastic episodes. And I'm very happy and excited to talk about the best ones here. Who knows? Maybe I might surprise you, just like Season 5. Or I'll be pretty predictable. Either way, let's just get right into it. Here are my top 5 best Simpsons Season 5 episodes. As with most of my lists, choosing the number 5 spot was incredibly difficult, because there are so many great episodes in this season to choose from that are very close in quality. I debated between this and Sweet Seymour Skinner's Badass Song for a while because I love both of them around the same amount, but for different reasons. Springfield is a fun episode about a brand new casino with an interesting look at Marge having a gambling addiction, while the Skinner episode is a much more character-driven episode, looking at his character and the role he plays on the show in relation to Bart. And I surprisingly went with the former. I have minor bugs with both these episodes that are very similar, and that's that the plots are a little underdeveloped for my liking in places. But I think in this episode, it bothers me just a teeny bit less. In a way, this is sort of a successor to Marge vs. the Monorail. Just a grand feeling concept of this brand new casino opening. And a lot of the episode just being about all these great character bits that happen in the casino. And so many amazing jokes that the episode gets out of it. And well, obviously, it's not as funny as that episode is. Not even close. But that's because it's not trying to be. The episode is much slower paced than that one is. And while it is focused on telling jokes, it tells jokes around this situation, which is showing off Marge having a gambling addiction. There's actually a serious story in the center of all these great character bits. And with all this going on, I actually think the pacing is really good. They set all this up really well, and how this fun plot about a brand new casino opening slowly transitions into Marge's story about her gambling addiction and how it affects her family. So much of this episode is spent in the casino with all these fun gags, but the stuff outside of it, showing how her addiction affects her family, is just as fleshed out, and can also be funny when they get comedic mileage out of it in a much more subtle way than some of the other stuff here. This episode manages to be really funny while telling an interesting story, and gets so much out of its pretty simple concept, at least compared to some of the other episodes in Season 5, but it balances all these elements perfectly and subverts your expectations of how an episode like this would be done with how they go about showing off her gambling addiction in just such a different episode, and the smart choice to make Marge the one who is addicted, which makes the story more interesting because of how hard it is to see her in this role, but how it makes the whole situation so much more serious. You take this plot more seriously because of how hard it is to imagine Marge being the one addicted. It shows that this can happen to anyone, which is really interesting, and I like that the episode shows this off. My minor issue with the episode, however, is even though I think it is really funny and incredibly interesting, I wish they would have dived into her gambling addiction a bit more and just how it affects her. Sure, they do a great job setting it up and showing how it affects her family around all these great scenes, but I just wish we went a bit more in depth of how it affects her and her inner turmoil and what keeps driving her to come back. It is a very simplistic view of a gambling addiction, and while making Marge the one addicted was really smart and does make some cool statements, and the episode does do a great job of showing how it affects everyone around her, I still think they could have done a bit more and gone a bit farther with just showing all this off and diving into her character just a bit more. Also, maybe more of a struggle to overcome the demon gambler. I know the whole point was the journey and was more about her coming to terms she has a gambling addiction than getting over it, which is really interesting, and I do like the ending a lot. I appreciate it for how this episode is structured and how it's a very different ending, but it does still feel a little bit easy that the episode just kinda stops like that, even if it is interesting and they do make a really funny joke out of it. It is just a bit too simple overall for my liking, but once again, that's a very minor problem, and I like how this episode is more used as a fun juxtaposition of this really interesting story involving how her gambling affects her family with all this fun casino stuff around it, and isn't necessarily about her or her struggle. It's just a really interesting way to tell an episode like this, and I admit, that's really cool, and I still like it a lot, which is why that's a very minor issue, but I still think it would have really done the episode wonders in the end. But in the end of the day, I really love how this episode uses the Season 5 subversiveness on pretty much all fronts at its absolute best. And it's just such a fun episode about something that really isn't fun at all, but because of how it's structured, it is a lot of fun. And while obviously it's not Season 5's best episode, it is still really great. But there are 4 episodes this season that I enjoy watching just a little bit more. Finally, a Treehouse of Horror episode made one of these lists, and it won't be the last. But yeah, this is definitely one of the best Treehouse of Horror episodes for 2 big reasons. The first is just the atmosphere itself. This episode looks gorgeous. There's so many beautiful scenes and shots here. Season 5 is definitely a step up in the directing and animation department, but this episode is on a whole nother level. It's just gorgeous, and the great atmosphere allows for each story to be very different from one another, while all looking amazing and the jokes being very spot on thanks to the great direction and pacing of all these stories. From the very gag-based first segment to the very fast-paced second one, all the way to the much slower, much more atmospheric third segment. It all just works so well because of how spot on the direction and atmosphere is, which leads each section to tell its story perfectly in very different ways while having some killer jokes, with my favorite wraparound segments of the series. This is the last true wraparound segment of the series for these Treehouse of Horror episodes, which is kind of sad, because here it really goes a long way to set the mood and makes these 3 stories feel even more complete, fitting into the overall theme. That theme being horror cliches. I've talked a lot about how the aesthetics of the episode make it work in general, but let's get into more specifics and quickly talk about the individual stories themselves. The Devil and Homer Simpson is a fun story about Homer facing off against Devil Flanders in a court-like setting after selling his soul to get a donut, and it might just be the best segment here. The concept itself reveals why it's so great. It's just a quick-witted, gag-filled segment that gets the most out of its concept, and from the start to finish is hilarious for how over-the-top but mundane at the same time the whole situation is, which makes it a lot funnier. Sure, there's not really any twists or turns, but why would you want there to be when the great jokes are all right here? And the episode segment isn't too predictable on top of that. It's still really funny and goes some interesting places. Some of my favorite gags being Homer eating all the donuts and Richard Nixon. But I'm not dead yet. Sure, the ending is a little lame, and maybe it could stand to be a teeny bit funnier in places, but that's so minor, and the segment is already funny enough for it not to matter. Terror at 5.5 Feet is a fun, intense parody of a Twilight Zone episode that gets the most out of its premise, from the great tension to the fact that at first you don't know if all of this is in Bart's imagination or if it's really there, and all the countless great jokes. It even takes some interesting turns in places. While it's not the funniest or the best here, it is the most intense and engaging. Bart Simpson's Dracula might not be the most funny or engaging story here, but it is the most gorgeous looking and atmospheric. In an episode that is already top-notch in this category, while the other segments have their moments too, and are overall amazing in this department, this is the most impressive. It really gets you into this slow story and the fun parody of the Dracula story with some great jokes and twists, and it leads to a really dumb but hilarious ending. But it is the presentation of this one which really sells it. Once again, the nice wraparound segments just makes the entire episode more complete, with the great atmosphere, how they set the stories up, and amazing jokes. The picture of the dogs being my favorite. So yeah, this is a fantastic episode, one of the best Halloween specials the show has ever done, so what topped it? My number one spot was always set from the get-go. It's the most obvious pick there is. But the rest of this list was quite a surprise to me while making it, just as Season 5 on whole was a surprise while watching. Both my number 3 and 2 spots were episodes that grew on me a ton while watching them for this list, and beat out an amazing episode like Treehouse of Horror 4, and I debated how exactly I wanted to rank them and which one was better. And in the end, Rosebud landed here. Simply put, this is one of the best Mr. Burns episodes, maybe if not the best. But that's a pretty loaded statement I'd have to think about a bit more, so I don't really want to back it up here. But the reason it's so good is because I love this story. Sure, this episode is really funny, but what pushes it over the edge for me is this conflict. This episode, right out of the gate, tells you exactly why Mr. Burns wants his childhood bear back and what it means to him. There's no real build-up to it, it's just blunt right away, gives you exactly his motivation for why he acts the way he does in this episode, and uses the whole party sequence to set up just how much he wants it even more, even though he's filthy rich and is getting showered with gifts from so many famous people, he still feels this sense of emptiness, which this episode portrays remarkably well. And they use this party to tell some killer jokes because this is still one of the funniest episodes of the season. So they use the first part of the episode to set all this up, be very blunt with his motivation, and then set up exactly why this affects him and how it affects him. And then we get into Homer getting a hold of this bear in the most random way possible, in a really fun sequence, and trying to get Mr. Burns to get him a sweet offer for it. So, a crap ton of money. And I love how they set all this up, and after cheap Mr. Burns finally caves to Homer, he can't give the bear up because Maggie wants it. And this is where the interesting conflict really kicks in. The struggle of Homer not wanting to give up the bear that his baby daughter loves so much, even though he would gain a lot by doing so, because at first I thought, oh, it's only one toy, and if he gives it to Mr. Burns, he could be rich and buy her a bunch of new toys and a bunch of other things for him and the rest of his family. But as the episode goes on, I realize that's kind of a horrible way to think. Because even though in this situation that might seem like a decent way to think, and how Mr. Burns does everything in his power to get the bear back in a ton of funny ways and scenes, no one can bring themselves to take the bear from this little girl, because it's just kind of on a basic level a scummy thing to do. What makes this episode so interesting, however, is the parallels it shows off. How Mr. Burns gave Bobo up for fame and fortune, and how Homer wants to make his daughter happy, so he won't do that exact same thing. Sure, the parallel isn't perfect, it doesn't connect completely, but there is some deeper context here, and it's still really interesting, and not only gives this episode a little extra depth, while painting such a good picture of Mr. Burns while juggling it with all this fun Mr. Burns antics, but it shows some really good things about Homer. The fact that he cares more about his daughter's happiness than money and even the most minor sense. Dumb Homer, the guy who can't read any situation and who almost gave up the bear earlier to get a free drink because he was so desperate to get a reward out of this, comes to this decision on his own, with no help or persuasion from anything else. Yeah, even when that money could really benefit him and the rest of his family. This is such a different portrayal of his character in a way that really builds him up and helps make this conflict more interesting than if Homer was constantly pushing the rest of the family to give the bear up and it was someone like Marge who initially said no. Sure, the whole scene where the town can't bring themselves to give up the bear to stop Mr. Burns' antics is a little overdone and kinda cheesy, but it still drives the point home and really shows such a nice thing. It's really sweet and very interesting. This episode is really just about characters being put in a very odd situation and them making choices based on what they personally value. And that's what I think makes this episode really interesting, and it just shows us such interesting things about both Homer and Mr. Burns' character. And once again, this plot isn't crazy deep or anything, and there's no part of this episode that is really as in-depth or shows as interesting things about our characters as some other episodes do, but it's still a very interesting and unique episode for how it goes about this weird plot and how it's still just so funny. But all this leads to the ending, which might just be my favorite scene in Season 5. It's so sweet in its simplicity. What Mr. Burns tells Maggie, and how she gives up the bear for him, and how comedic it is at the same time while being very powerful. It's so weird, and you're not quite sure how you're supposed to take it, but as the episode points out, it's an ending. And in the end, when he gets down on this child's level, she gives him what he wanted. And how even though you're not really supposed to know how you feel out of it, that's kind of the episode. It's just an interesting situation where the characters have to make certain decisions, and you're not quite sure if you always agree with them, but that's just what makes it so interesting. And it's just such a powerful ending. It's really sweet, and is really funny, just because of how the whole situation plays out, especially that final gag. It's a great ending, and ends such an interesting episode, and a very funny episode on a high note. But after this long spiel about how great this whole thing was and why I love it, what could top it? I'm not quite sure why I decided to put this one above Rosebud, because on paper, it probably isn't as funny, and doesn't at first glance look like it goes as far with its plot, because it has a kind of tacked on subplot to reach the 22-minute running time, or at least that's how it seems at first. but in execution, I think this is one of the most creative and subversive episodes of the series, and does go the furthest with its concept. And for that, I find it a bit more interesting overall, even if Rosebud might be the better put together episode on whole. But that's a whole different discussion, and I want to talk more about why this episode is so great and why I find it so interesting. This episode isn't your typical marriage drama, or hell, even a really good marriage drama for this show. It's something completely different and awesome. If the last episode built up Homer's character in a great way and put him in an interesting situation, this episode does that too, but the situation is even more interesting. Because it's a lot less of a situation, and this episode is more focused on a simple question played out into an episode. That question being, what would it take for Homer to cheat on Marge? How many things would have to line up perfectly to push him in that direction? And if all these things did line up, would he do it? And that is why this episode is fantastic. It lays out this really interesting idea and just rolls with it. Everything that happens to Homer in this episode pushes him closer and closer to Mindy. Even his own fantasies. It's borderline ridiculous levels of over the top and contrived, but that's what makes this episode so fun and interesting and really funny. You, along with Homer, feel like the universe is pushing him to hook up with Mindy, and after everything, the episode has him make a very blunt decision. And I think that's what makes it all so great. What I like about the episode is just how blunt and over the top its intentions are, while the character writing and interactions, in contrast, are so down to earth and human. I could not believe how engaged I was watching the episode, how interested I was to see where the episode was gonna go next with trying to persuade Homer to get with Mindy, and how he would deal with each situation, and how even though I've seen this episode before, watching it, I still have doubts when we get to the final scene because the writing is so good, and it's just so damn impressive. The episode had me on the edge of my seat the entire time, and while it's weird and blunt, it's a pretty chill and kind of calm episode overall. But man, those character interactions and how much it feels like the world is pressuring Homer just sells this one for me. Once again, this is a Simpsons episode, so obviously Homer isn't gonna get with Mindy in any way, shape, or form, but once again, the episode is just so well written to the point where you could see it ending up like this, which is really cool. I think what really makes the episode, along with the fact that it's just an interesting concept, as I said earlier, but the other thing is that, once again, it's not a marriage drama. This story isn't about Marge. She plays such a minor role here. We have had 4 seasons up until this point, and a ton of seasons after, to understand Homer and Marge's relationship, and what Marge means to Homer. Let's just have an episode to truly put that to the test, with pretty much the universe pushing Homer to fail. With all the jokes in this episode not only being very funny, but actually making the plot better because most of them are used to push Homer more towards Mindy. Even the jokes in the episode, he can't escape her. And the character interactions, once again, are what brings it all home. Mindy could have been a generic plot device. And well, in a sense, she is. The episode does find the right balance between her being used to move the plot along and for her to be the perfect, compatible character with Homer, sharing a ton of personality traits with him, while also feeling like a real person dealing with this situation too. She has such good chemistry with Homer, as she should, because that's how she's written. And their interactions are just perfect because of that. And it really serves this plot and helps it really drive home the point that every little detail is pushing him closer to her. But that is also due to Homer, who is amazing in this episode. This is without a doubt one of his best appearances to date. This is a story that would only work for Homer Simpson, not anyone else. I believe Homer loves Marge too much to cheat on her, as I've said in previous videos, which is why creating a normal marriage drama episode around Homer is such an uphill battle. And while it had mild success in the past, it's never been anything amazing because of this point. However, I do believe he would be attracted to another girl, and then find himself in a situation where everything feels like it's pushing him to her, to the point where he thinks these signs must mean something more, and in the end he has to make a decision that would be so easy normally. It's such an interesting portrayal of his character. We get to look at him through so many different things, and along with all the other great elements in the episode, it's all capped off with a sweet, maybe a little predictable and quick, but nonetheless satisfying ending. Okay, very predictable, but still sweet nonetheless. Oh, and through all this, there's a Bart subplot, which is good. In such an interesting episode, it's definitely the weakest point, but it's funny and nicely breaks up the awkwardness of the main plot, which may have come off as a bit much and a bit overdone and too contrived if it wasn't shortened a little bit. I think this episode is perfect for the length it is, the main plot anyways, and I definitely think this subplot helps balance it out and make it a bit more tighter paced overall. It's strange how it works, and it could feel very tacked on. As I said earlier, on paper, it kind of looks tacked on, but in execution, I think it really works and serves the episode nicely. But even if I think this main plot is really well paced, and they do a ton with it, and the subplot does nicely break up points where it could feel like a bit too much and way too over the top to the point where it's hard to take seriously, which makes the episode better paced overall. I definitely think this leads to the plot not being as fleshed out as it could be in places, because while I like that this episode is smart enough to not fall into normal marriage drama traps and not involve Marge that much, I do think we could have seen a bit more of what she means to Homer in this specific episode in particular, making this conflict and the ending a bit more impactful. Let me make it perfectly clear. This is a very minor problem, and overall, the episode is fleshed out very well, and we really don't need this to make any part of this episode more impactful or more satisfying. But I do think it being underdeveloped a teeny bit, that whole aspect anyways, doesn't make what is inevitably a very predictable, ridiculously predictable, because that's how the show works, ending impactful, because Marge is just not a part of this episode at all. Once again, I appreciate that the show thinks we're smart enough to not have to bring attention to that here, but I think it could have worked to the episode's favor to just show that part off a bit more. So I do think that is what kept the episode from being number one. And while I love this episode, there was always one other episode in Season 5 that's a bit more well-rounded and goes even further with its concept. But damn, was this a grower, and I love this one to pieces, and wish it would have been structured just a teeny bit differently so I would have been able to surprise you guys and give it the number one spot. But I gave the number one spot to the most obvious choice. But before I reveal what you're all expecting to be number one, I have to give a shout out to 9 honorable mentions that didn't quite make the list, but deserve to be talked about for just overall being great episodes. A fun story about Homer and his group finding success and breaking up for various reasons, just to come back together for one show, just for good old time's sake. It's pretty funny, and as cliched as the episode is, it's intentionally so. It gets a lot of comedic mileage out of playing around with these cliches of these kind of stories, along with a lot of other jokes here. I actually really like the story overall because of how they play around with the cliches, and the ending is very sweet because of it. While not one of my personal favorites because of how all over the place it can be, it is worth a mention for just being such a fun episode that tries to deal with so many different things. And while I have minor issues with it, it achieves what it tries to do overall incredibly well. Starting off crazy and slowly working its way into a Bart and Homer story involving scouts. And bad things ensue. And it is a blast to watch, even with some minor issues I have with it. This actually used to be my favorite of the season, but after rewatching it, well, I like the commentary the episode shows off on being famous, for one thing, and how far it goes to show that off while being incredibly meta in places and having a ton of great jokes. The story itself is kind of too generic in places for my liking. But it's still a funny, thought-provoking episode either way. Oh, this was an episode I really wanted to make the list, because it is really interesting and has a lot of funny jokes. And as I've said countless times, I really appreciate a good Lisa episode. But just like the last one, I think this episode is just too generic in places for my liking, even if overall I really like this story and where they go with it, and how they choose to show off the doll making industry and the way Lisa tries to combat them, but it wasn't enough to make the list. Sorry, Lisa, maybe next season you'll get a true winner of an episode. This episode is amazing for its spectacle and great jokes. It has a ton of fun with its concept. While the actual story is a bit half-baked at points, it's overall really good, and is used as a way to have this amazing spectacle of an episode and tell these killer jokes. Just not fleshed out enough overall to make the list. This episode, by all accounts, should not work. It should be really annoying. And when I first watched it, I did think it was. But time has shown me that this episode is kinda great. Homer accidentally torturing Ned for no reason by being super close to him could be annoying at best and frustrating at worst. But what makes it work is how well the jokes are written and how well they portray Homer as crazy and in the wrong. And most of it is just harmless. And because it's so well written in a comedic way, and seeing normal, calm Ned try to deal with this is a lot of fun as he gets more and more annoyed and the situations just keep getting crazier and weirder. Sure, sometimes it is a bit too much and they take it a little too far for it to be funny, and it is kind of annoying, but overall the jokes are written so well that I don't care how unjustified this treatment of Ned is. This episode really shows how well the writing can really prop up jokes that wouldn't be funny if the writing was either subpar or not very good. The writing has to be specifically great for these kind of jokes to work if there's not enough justification originally, and here it definitely does. Like Boy Scouts in the Hood, this episode is a bit all over the place, but it deals with a lot of fun ideas and handles them pretty well while getting a lot of interesting stuff and funny jokes out of this strange plot. Even if some of it is a little underdeveloped and the whole episode is a bit too uneven for my liking, it's still a lot of fun and a very interesting little episode. A really fun episode that gives us a great look into Skinner's character while developing him through this strange situation and his interactions with Bart, along with having some killer jokes throughout. And for the 100th episode, it makes a lot of sense to focus on the relationship between Bart and Skinner. As I said earlier, this was close to making the list, but I just find this story a little too cliched. And for a season that loves its subversiveness, the solution to the problem is way too simple and straightforward. Still a great episode to celebrate The Simpsons 100th. A fun opening which leads to a very interesting conflict, which subverts your expectations at a few points, but is just a bit lacking in comedy for my liking to make the list, even though it is pretty funny overall. Also, the ending is a bit too simple for an episode like this, but with all that said, let's finish this list and finally get into my... Oh, of course it's Cape Feare. You know it, I know it, the whole world knows it, even before hinting at it through this entire video. This choice was pretty obvious, and just like my last two Simpsons lists, the popular consensus is the correct one, because not only is this the best Sideshow Bob episode, and the best episode of Season 5, but one of the best episodes of the series. It truly is great, and here's why. Once again, simply put, like most of the best episodes, this episode is really funny. Every joke works. It's one of the funniest episodes of the series, which is why it's one of the best. From its initial setup, to the Thompsons, to the ending scheme, and every big and little moment in between it. All of them works. They're all great, and all of them are a laughing riot. But even ignoring how funny all of the episode is, at the same time, it's just paced really well. It balances the comedy around a really intense story, and neither suffers. Even with all these fun gags, you still feel the tension, and that Bart is in total danger at some points. But at the same time, Sideshow Bob can be a total laughingstock at others. The episode just balances great tension and comedy perfectly, making it one of The Simpsons' best outings. The episode always keeps you guessing on every front. You never know where the episode is going to go story-wise or comedy-wise. It's just so creative and fun, and it's got such a good plot that leads to so many interesting scenes, but at the same time, so many funny scenes. It truly is amazing. And it's very hard to put into words just how great it is, because it uses its characters in such amazing ways, and overall has one of the best lists of jokes. How the episode, which plot is basically just Sideshow Bob stalking Bart and threatening to kill him, can be this goofy, but so dark at the same time and be a perfect blend of both. It's just so damn impressive, and on that note, it uses its inspiration well. I haven't seen the source material this episode is based on, but from what I've heard, they definitely use the inspiration from the source material in cool ways. And if that wasn't enough, with this great story and amazing pacing and some of the best jokes, the animation and atmosphere here is just fantastic. It's the most visually interesting and best looking of not just the season, but maybe of the show. And it's what really pushes this one over the edge for me, because of how it brings to life a lot of these already great scenes and makes them so visually appealing to make the episode better. Top that all off with one of the greatest sequences in Simpsons history, along with all the other amazing jokes, like the rake joke. Hi, Mr. Thompson, all the other great stuff. God, there's so many, and I want to list them all, but that'd be really boring. But with all that, you have one of the best episodes in Simpsons history. It's pretty much perfect in every way, and once again, I know it's predictable, but it's the right choice, because the episode is just that good. And it was the only episode that could reasonably take the #1 spot, and it is easily my favorite episode of Simpsons Season 5. And with that, the list is done. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe for more content similar to this in the future. I'm trying to release 2 of these big videos a month, so any support is greatly appreciated. Also, leave me a comment down below telling me what you thought of my list and what your own list would have been. This is such a strange season in so many different ways that's a lot of fun to talk about, so I'd love to hear what you have to say. Also, a playlist with all the music I used in this video is linked in the description, with all the information about those pieces, giving credit to the creators, are in those videos, in that playlist. And, with that said, my top 5 best Hey Arnold Season 3 episodes list will be coming next, followed after that with my top 5 worst Hey Arnold Seasons 1 through 3 episodes list. I'm very excited about both of these lists, especially the best of Season 3, because it's my favorite season of the show, and one of my favorite seasons of just any show, period. So I'm really looking forward to talking about the best episodes of it. So, until then, this is Chocolate Guy, signing off.